maybe what I'll do is I will start the seminar. I want to welcome everybody to what amounts to our second June Environmental Health Center seminar. We've been fortunate enough to have Elizabeth Matsui from the University of Texas at Austin join us today. Uh, she is quite an accomplished, well, she's a professor of population health and pediatrics at UT Austin, but is quite a well-known and accomplished pediatric allergist, immunologist. She's been interested for a long period of time in understanding house-related exposures, particularly for asthmatic children, and understanding some of the issues involved. And she trained at UC San Francisco, but has spent, and then did some residency and so forth in hospital system, but sort of built her research career at Johns Hopkins over much of the past 2 decades, actually, before joining the UT Austin faculty just a few years ago. And so her work is in terms of understanding inner city asthma has a lot to do with the work she has done in Baltimore. And I expect she'll be talking about the whole broad array of things. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. I really wish I could be there in person, and but this is wonderful because it gets me, even though it's on Zoom, it's really refreshing to be outside of my UT Austin bubble, because I've been in it for a few months, just as you have been in your own bubbles for a few months. So I'm going to keep an eye on time here, and because it's Zoom, I'm just going to present, and I'm going to aim to wrap up in about 45 minutes or so. So there's time for questions. And I'm also more than happy if there's anything that I have to skip over to talk about it at a later time. So this first slide is really trying to set the stage for inner city childhood asthma. And I put inner city in quotes, and you'll see why as I get further along in my talks. But the definition of an inner city, of course, is a low-income area in the center of cities. The racial and ethnic minority populations often comprise the majority of residents, and the asthma prevalence rates are incredibly high in some of these communities. There we go. So I show this picture of this. This is a boy who was in one of our studies, because I think mentally, when the term inner city is used, we conflate that with race. And I think that that can get us into a lot of difficulties in terms of framing the disparity problem in a way that we can actually make headway. So I think we think of inner city, and in many areas of the country, that is equivalent to someone who is both poor and Black. That's not to say that we should ignore race. We need to think about race and ethnicity because it's the way that we document and measure disparities. And here is a figure of asthma hospital discharge rates over time. And the point of this slide is that tragically, we have made really no headway in terms of the disparity in asthma hospitalizations between Blacks and non-Blacks. And this is over a period of time where inhaled corticosteroids came to be and are widely used and widely available. So there's another problem going on here that we need to address. I tried to get at this problem with a collaborator of mine, Corinne Keat, and we use Medicaid data to try to understand whether there's something specific about living in a poor urban neighborhood that contributes to asthma morbidity, that's independent of race. And so we linked Medicaid data to zip code level data about poverty, and the National Center for Health Statistics data that classified zip codes in terms of urban or rural status. And what you can see, the take-home point is really on the right panel here, is that the association between residents in the inner city and asthma morbidity is depicted on that right panel, which is adjusted for race, ethnicity, age, and sex. And there's still an independent effect of living in a poor urban neighborhood. And So when I talk with people who are in environmental health sciences, of course, I'm preaching to the choir and I don't need to convince you of this. But I will often show pictures of Baltimore to illustrate the built environment and how it could be problematic. So this first picture is a series of row homes in Baltimore. Baltimore is really known for this type of housing. And I don't know if you can see my mouse, my cursor there, but you can see there are some vacant row homes next to occupied row homes. And that's a setup for pest infestation. Here's the back of an abandoned row home. And here are a couple of pictures indoors in a home where you can see there are holes and cracks where pests can enter the home. And right about the time that I was thinking about what I wanted to do after residency, this paper came out in the New England Journal, which was a landmark paper demonstrating an association between cockroach allergen exposure and asthma morbidity in a multi-center inner city asthma study. And what you can see are these green bars depict here hospitalizations among the children in the study who had a positive skin test to cockroach and high cockroach allergen exposure in their bedroom. And the same group had greater unscheduled medical visits. Their caregivers had to change their plans more frequently because of the child's asthma. And I think at that time, this happens over and over again in science. I think collectively there was this sort of sense of, aha, we know what the mystery is. We've solved the problem of this disproportionate asthma morbidity among low income and minority kids. And what followed on the study was another landmark study that intervened on the home environment. And this paper was published in 2004. And it was a 1-year randomized clinical trial, and they had a 1-year follow-up period. A little over 900 kids participated. They had to be sensitized to an indoor allergen. They had to have some evidence of exacerbations in the past 6 months. And the intervention was an educational and behavioral intervention that was designed to support the delivery of an individually tailored, multifaceted intervention, meaning the intervention that they received was tailored to what the child was sensitive to, and multifaceted in that all of the relevant exposures, and this emphasized allergens, were addressed in the intervention. The primary outcome was days of asthma symptoms, and then allergen concentrations were measured every 6 months. And this is, at least in the area of work I do, a very well-known figure. You can see here in the intervention group, which is represented by this red line, that they had a marked decrease in symptom days, which is a primary outcome variable, and a greater decrease than the control group. And this is also a classic scenario, which is that there's a huge regression to the mean effect in asthma. So you always have to be suspicious, of course, when there's not a control group in an intervention study. And then other symptoms were also decreased, as well as unscheduled visits, and there was no effect on lung function. I'm going to come back to this later about this 1-year follow-on finding that they had. So these were sort of, 2004, this paper came out. I guess I had finished fellowship by then, but the cockroach paper was published in 1997. And I mentioned in an earlier meeting that when I first started fellowship, my mentor, Peyton Eggleston, was trying to figure out if we could take surface wipes and use ELISAs to quantify allergen content in those wipes instead of collect settled dust samples. And so I went to some friends' homes, and they lived in renovated row homes in Baltimore that looked like the one illustrated here. And lo and behold, there's mouse allergen in the kitchen counter wipes. And I, thought that this was, kind of disgusting and notable, but I didn't really think beyond the ick factor, and had a good chuckle over it with, the friends whose homes I had been in. But eventually it got me thinking, and I went and looked at other studies that had been published, and also had got dust that had been saved from previous studies that my mentor had done and measured mouse allergen in it. And over time, we sort of established this consistent picture of dust samples from Baltimore homes, or typically homes of kids with asthma here, for example, have more than 1,000-fold higher concentrations of mouse allergen than dust samples from a population of kids with asthma in suburban Maryland. And you can see that the Baltimore mouse allergen concentration, this is the median, was even much larger than, this is the National Cooperative Intercity Asthma Study, which had a median of 1.6. We also went on to find that mouse allergen was detectable in air samples. These were PM10 samples in 80 to 90% of the bedrooms of these kids. About 25% of the homes had concentrations of mouse allergen in air samples that were similar to what we had measured at the Jackson labs in some mouse rooms. And about 50% of those of kids in Baltimore with asthma, significant asthma, are sensitized to mouse. So we recruited through the emergency room, and on average, about half those kids are sensitized to mouse. So you have this picture, emerging, that you would then maybe expect that those who were sensitized and exposed to mouse would be at greater risk of a host of measures of asthma morbidity. The one I'm showing here is the predicted percentage of people who will have an acute visit among the group that's mouse sensitized and exposed. So it's over 50. And that's an acute visit in the subsequent 3 months. These are non-mouse sensitized, non-mouse exposed group here. So the baseline rate is about 30%. So there are clearly other factors going on, but mouse is predominant, and you can see there's not a major effect of cockroach sensitization and exposure. And we demonstrated this association not just with acute visits, but with symptoms, with lung function decrements, with exhaled nitric oxide. And I'd like to point out the time period over which this took place. So the first sort of paper maybe that we published related to mouse allergen exposure was published in 2005 or so, and the first morbidity paper was 2006. And this was an issue from the Atlantic magazine in the science section from December 2018. They listed the 83 things that blew their minds in 2018, and this actually came out of a discussion I had about another topic with one of their journalists, that mouse urine is a major cause of asthma for poor kids in Baltimore. Of course, they didn't get this quite right. It doesn't cause incident asthma, but it appears to cause exacerbations. And so here are some other papers that have supported this finding, including a paper from, this is from the Intercity Asthma Study, which is a multi-center study. So can you get rid of it? And this was a question I was asked in a previous meeting. So we tested this hypothesis. We did a 1-year randomized clinical trial testing the effect of an intensive professionally delivered mouse integrated pest management intervention. And this was a 2-site study. So Boston was our other site. We enrolled 5 to 17-year-olds with persistent asthma. They had to be sensitized to mouse. And then we also collected a dust sample from their home, and they had to have a certain concentration of mouse allergen as their exposure inclusion criterion. And then they were randomized to either the education group or the integrated pest management and education group. And the integrated pest management and education group would get an integrated pest module delivered after randomization, and then repeated if infestation persisted or recurred. So the education visit involved a brief 20 or 30-minute home visit, and example supplies were shown. And the intensive professionally delivered integrated pest management intervention included setting of traps by the study team, identification of holes and cracks. We contracted with a pest management firm so that there were licensed pest technicians that applied rodenticide inside the holes and cracks. The holes and cracks were sealed, so there was exclusion work done. The research team did targeted cleaning to try to get rid of reservoirs of allergen We also used HEPA-like air purifiers. 2 were provided and installed in the homes of the kids enrolled. We provided and installed allergen impermeable mattress and pillow encasements. And then, as I said, the visits were repeated throughout the year for persistent or recurrent infestation. And so the take-home message was, this was a negative trial. So there was no difference between the IPM and education groups in terms of any morbidity, symptom measurements, anything. And there was also no difference between the groups in terms of allergen exposure measures. And this is really important because I have seen papers like this published that present the results from this sort of trial, and you have to interpret the primary outcome in the context of what happened to exposure, because if the intervention worked and you didn't change exposure, it would suggest that the intervention was mediated through a different pathway than the exposure that you're evaluating. If it didn't work and you did reduce exposure, it would suggest that exposure was not important and didn't have a causal relationship with the outcome you were examining. And then in this case, the trial was negative, so the intervention didn't work relative to the comparison group, and there was no difference in allergen. So what this suggests is that, you know, that we're not able to lower allergen with this intervention to a greater extent than than we could lower it with education alone. But what was puzzling was that when we've just done cohort studies, there's not a large amount of temporal variability in mouse allergen. In this study, both groups had on average about a 70% reduction in their home mouse allergen levels. And sort of a rule of thumb that's been bandied about but never really published is that we think that you need at least about a 50% reduction in settle dust allergen at a minimum in order to see a clinical effect. We also, so we thought, okay, maybe there should be a clinical effect if we analyze the group as a cohort, and we had in fact pre-specified such an analysis. So we combined the groups and we evaluated the relationship between mouse allergen exposure and these many outcomes. These are just selected ones that we examined. And so this is from those models, a predicted change in asthma morbidity for a 90% reduction in mouse allergen. And about 45% of the kids had a 90% reduction in mouse allergen at least one visit over the course of the study. And that degree of mouse allergen reduction was associated with an estimated 0.8 fewer acute visits per year, or just under 1 per person, 0.4 fewer ED visits per year, so about a half fewer ED visits per year, or 1 fewer per 2 people, and then 0.07 fewer hospitalizations per person per year. So what does this mean exactly? There's not a lot of data comparing inhaled corticosteroids to placebo, and we were interested in how this observational effect might be interpreted in the context of the effect of inhaled corticosteroids. So there was a clinical trial in the 90s, the Childhood Asthma Management Program, that randomized kids with persistent asthma to either placebo or budesonide. And they found that budesonide was associated with 0.1 fewer urgent care visits and 0.02 fewer hospitalizations per person per year. And you can see that these numbers are much, much smaller than the estimates that we got. The caveat here is, of course, the estimates we got are from an observational analysis. And so we're not comparing apples to apples. But I still think that this is an important way to think about the effect of environmental interventions, because we often expect them, seems like the bar for them is often much higher than it is for medications that are, you know, approved and paid for by insurance. So this suggests that it's possible that if we're able to reduce mouse allergen at least, that we could have an effect that was at least as big as the effect of inhaled corticosteroids. I'm maybe going to pass on the video, and if there's time, I'll come back to it, but I wanted to point out that we established a community advisory board at the beginning of all of this work. And we actually celebrated our 10-year anniversary right before I moved here to Texas 2 years ago. And in collaboration with them, we made 2 educational videos. One described the study results, and this one that is embedded here in this talk is an instructional video that provides guidance about how to implement your own integrated pest management. So I'm also interested in the long-term effects of allergen exposure and allergen reduction. And I mentioned earlier that I was going to come back to this particular study. And what you can see here is this intervention, this home multifaceted, individually tailored home intervention stopped at 12 months, but the follow-up continued to 24 months. And the differences between the intervention and the control groups persisted beyond the first year, suggesting that unlike inhaled corticosteroids and other treatments that we have, that the effects of an intervention, a home environmental intervention, are sustained beyond the actual delivery of the intervention. And you can see that although unscheduled visits did not remain reduced to a greater extent in the intervention group in year 2, a whole host of symptom outcomes remained lower in the intervention group than the control group. And I think that this begs the question as to how we think of, the non-pharmacologic interventions that we administer, and that we often just use a drug development and approval framework for thinking about them. And I think that that can limit the questions that we ask and limit the impact that we may be able to demonstrate for these interventions. So this was a paper that just was published a few months ago, and this was a study done by a mentee of mine, Tori Grant, and it's also related to long-term outcomes of allergen exposure and allergen exposure reduction. What we know from the CAMP study is that about 75% of children who have persistent asthma have abnormal lung function when they reach adulthood. I mean, to me, this was a shocker. And in this paper, about 10% met criteria for chronic obstructive lung disease, or COPD. So we wanted to know, in that mouse allergen and asthma intervention trial population, what happened to their lung function if they were able to, among the set that sort of had persistently lowered their mouse allergen. And here's what we found. So we found that children in that study who have a reduction in mouse allergen exposure, and in this case, it's a 75% or greater, and it's persistent through the whole year, they have 75 to 100 mLs greater lung growth than those who don't. And that's illustrated here. There was a difference for post-bronchodilator FEV1 by about 50 mLs. That finding was not statistically significant. I don't remember the 95% confidence interval, but the p-value was, like 0.07 or something like that. But at least this suggests that it may be that, just like some of the studies and observations that your group have made related to outdoor air pollution exposure, that indoor exposures to allergens like mouse allergen may have an effect on lung growth. And of course, I don't have to tell you that this has enormous implications for adult lung health, and then even mortality, because FEV1 is such a strong predictor of mortality in adulthood. So what had we learned so far? So we learned that you can reduce indoor allergen levels only because it happened both in the control or comparison group and the intervention group. So we know it's feasible. We know that there's an association, and that you have to reduce it by a fair amount in order to achieve significant clinical benefit. Targeting a single allergen is promising, and that if the intervention had successfully reduced mouse allergen to a greater extent than the control group, at least conceptually, you could try to identify what the major allergen was in a community and think about population level interventions. The other challenge, though, is that many of the children in this study, about 40% of them, still had mouse allergen concentrations in their dust from their homes that are known to be strongly associated with morbidity. So there was certainly not success in terms of having someone's home become a healthy home. So we need new intervention strategies. So around this time, and this must have been in 2010 or so, we started thinking about, well, what's the root cause? Why is it that we really are not having the kind of success that we thought we would have? I mean, we handpicked a pest management company that understood the importance of doing exclusion work or sealing up holes and cracks. And obviously I had found mouse allergen in kitchen counter wipes in, fancier neighborhoods in Baltimore where the row homes had been renovated. And really, the root cause, and I think this is apt in particular for the issues that are finally becoming, I think, more mainstream is not the right word, but the general public is becoming more aware of redlining and the reasons why we have areas of concentrated poverty with deteriorated housing and neighborhood conditions. And so in thinking about that, we dug a little bit into the history in Baltimore, and this history is not so different from many other cities in the US. And it turns out that Baltimore had one of the first, and it may have been the first, Jim Crow measure on record as it relates to housing. And so a Black man bought a house in a white neighborhood, and this prompted Baltimore to adopt this regulation. And the regulation was that a Black person could not move into a neighborhood that was more than 50% white, and a white person could not move into a neighborhood that was more than 50% Black. And this measure made it into the New York Times, and I don't know if you can see the date, but it was in the December 25th, 1910 issue of the New York Times. And of course, this group is quite familiar with redlining, which came along in the 1930s and 1960s. And so you start to have the forces that create highly segregated neighborhoods and then start stripping away any kind of resources and wealth from those neighborhoods. And so those two forces act together to create highly segregated and areas of concentrated poverty. And this has continued to go on in some form or another. There was a Supreme Court case related to housing discrimination, I think as recently as 2012. And here you can see an example from 2017. This was data put out by the Baltimore Equity Office. The neighborhoods with concentrated poverty or high poverty neighborhoods got the least amount of funding. And so these neighborhoods continue to have disinvestment in them. And not surprisingly, this is a figure that was published by the Washington Post. These are hospitalizations. So the percentage of the population within each of these zip code areas with one or more hospitalizations for asthma. And you can see this butterfly pattern basically is highly correlated with the redlining areas. And so the legacy of what started before the Jim Crow era and everything is why we are seeing the health disparities that we see. And I think taking it back to the mouse allergen problem, if you have deteriorated neighborhoods and housing conditions, intervening on one home or even on a block is not going to fix the problem. So we partnered with a nonprofit called the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program that is a housing mobility program. And they are funded because there was a 1995 lawsuit against HUD that charged that HUD had violated fair housing laws because families in Baltimore that had federal housing vouchers would rarely move to the term that they use as an opportunity neighborhood, even though housing in opportunity neighborhoods existed, so that the way that they administered the program was discriminatory because families would just move to equally poor housing in equally poor neighborhoods. And so the settlement, HUD lost, there was a settlement that set aside a special set of housing vouchers for assisted housing to help families move to opportunity neighborhoods. And so we are doing a prospective cohort study of kids with asthma in partnership with the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, with the idea of now we're following kids who move and choose to move from a high poverty neighborhood to a low poverty neighborhood. And we're assessing the exposures indoors, and we have a plan to also look at outdoor air pollution exposures and how those change when they move and how their asthma changes. And so this is potentially a more potent intervention than trying to intervene on an individual home in a neighborhood with high poverty. And there are lots of discussions of people who, one of the co-PIs is Craig Pollack, who thinks about housing policy and whether there's a way to leverage healthcare dollars to pay for housing policy. So this study is, underway until COVID, and we're in discussions about whether to go ahead and analyze the data now, because we have 140 kids enrolled and 85% of them have moved so far. We have not followed them all. The protocol calls for them to be followed for a year after they move. So we're not complete with that part yet. So in the last, I guess, 15 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about Austin. I show these slides because Central Texas is beautiful, but it's also very different from Baltimore in terms of its built environment and its climate and geography. There's a very vibrant Latinx population and African American population. These are examples of some of the murals that are in East Austin, which is the area of Austin where that has a large proportion of minority residents. So when I moved here, it was like starting from scratch because a lot of people didn't even understand sort of basic epidemiology of asthma in Travis County. So Austin and Travis County are often talked about and conflated. They're not exactly the same, but most of Austin is contained within Travis County, but not all of it. So I'm going to use mostly Travis County as the geographic defining region for the population here. So we tapped into the Texas Healthcare Information Collection data set. And in Texas, every hospital is required to report emergency department visits and hospitalizations. And so the Texas State Health Department takes these data, and they can be, there's a publicly available version of them, and we purchased the data because we were able to map hospitalizations and ED visits down to the census tract level, and I'll show you some of the maps we've created. So first, I just wanted to understand what the population-based incidence rates were for asthma, ED visits, and hospitalizations. And you can see here, this is for children, that the emergency department visit population-based incidence rate is a little bit higher, although these 95% confidence intervals are overlapping with the national rate for children. But the hospitalization rate is higher. And whether we have not looked at 2018 data yet, so maybe there's a downtrend here, but the national hospitalization rate for asthma is about 10 per 10,000 person years. And in Austin, among children, it looks like it's between 13 and 19 or so. So that's not a trivial difference. Rebecca Zarate, who's a PhD candidate in the quantitative methods program here, is leading this work, and Corey Ziegler is a collaborator. So we also wanted to look by race and ethnicity, and among non-Latinx white kids in Travis County, you can see they may have a few more emergency department visits, but not significantly different, but they do have more hospitalizations. Among Black and African American kids in Travis County, they are, you know, have a similar pattern here. These hospitalization rates are not statistically significantly different from one another, but you can see how wide this 95% confidence interval is for the US data. So it's quite large. And then the Travis County African American population is only about 8% of the total population, which also makes the estimates less precise. And then we don't have national data for Latinx kids. So these numbers here, the ED visit population-based incidence rate is lower than that for white kids or Black kids in Travis County, as is the hospitalization rate. But I will point out that, and this is apropos of a conversation I've had earlier today with some of you, that, and this was a paper published just a couple years ago, that in the US as a whole, that Mexican American children with asthma actually have a similar hospitalization rate to Black African American children with asthma in the US. So about 7% of them are hospitalized on average in a year, which is several-fold higher than non-Latinx white kids. And in Central Texas, Mexican Americans comprise about more than 75% of the Latinx population, which is roughly a little more than a third of the population. So what about the spatial distribution? Here is the distribution of asthma-related ED visits. We've collapsed 2016 and 2017 data. This is Travis County. And so here on the eastern side of Travis County, I'll show you in the next slide, is where more of the poverty is and where more ethnic and racial minority populations reside. The national rate here, remember, is about 55. And so you can see these areas are below the national rate in terms of the population-based incidence rate for asthma-related ED visits. And here are lots of areas that are above that rate. Here's the same map, but this is the percent of households below the federal poverty line. And again, this is on the east side of Travis County mainly. And you get above, so this color, hopefully you can see my arrow, is 20 to 30% of households below the federal poverty line. And so there are quite a few census tracts here that meet that definition. And then this is a map depicting the percentage of the residents in each census tract that are Latinx or Black. And you can see, there's significant segregation here, and that the highest proportion are on the eastern side of Travis County. And you'll remember this map, which was a map of ED visit population-based incidence rates by census tract. You see here we stratified it by race and ethnicity, and you really see the same pattern, that the preponderance of asthma ED visit burden is in the census tracts in eastern Travis County, and that's true among all three of these racial and ethnic groups. So Austin also has a history that's not that different from Baltimore's history. So this was a project that the Statesman did, which is a local paper. And there was a district that was established that was called the Negro District. And this emerged in 1928. And this district was the only part of the city where African Americans could access schools and other public services. And so that led, of course, African Americans to be concentrated in that neighborhood. And the same people who proposed the strategy, which was implemented, Koch and Fowler, also proposed that the district have the city's weakest zoning restrictions. And so you can see these Anglo neighborhoods with zoning protections are these yellow neighborhoods. And then the minority neighborhoods without zoning protections. And to relate this to the other maps that you saw, this is zoomed in a little bit in the more central part of Travis County, as this is Austin proper. And so this is the eastern side of Austin. And so in addition to concentrating minority populations on the east side of Austin, there were fewer zoning protections. And you can see, not surprisingly, here's Travis County. These bubbles are data from the toxic release inventory, and they show you, and then a point source inventory to show you where these pollution sources exist. And this is overlaid on top of a map that shows the percentage of each of these census tracts of Latinx residents. And so there's a spatial correlation between these two, and that's not a surprise because of the lax zoning regulations that were associated with the establishment of the separate district for African Americans. And so this is an overview of a study that I'm going to launch the cross-sectional portion of the study, but ultimately it's going to turn into a longitudinal study. And I just submitted an R01 to support the longitudinal component. And the conceptual framework here is that residential discrimination informs the degree of poverty of the neighborhood that someone lives in. And that degree of poverty informs the profile of indoor and outdoor exposures, which in turn shape the phenotypic expression of asthma, as well as the morbidity, and will affect lung function growth. And so you can see the aims laid out here are related to understanding the relationships between neighborhood poverty, these asthma outcomes, including the phenotype and the lung function growth, and then understanding whether any of those effects might be mediated by the profile of indoor and outdoor exposures. And the context of this, of course, is racial and ethnic disparities in asthma. I have a shout out to my team that came up with a fun acronym, which is the Texas Home Assessment of Asthma and Lung Exposure, so TexHALE. And so this is a study that we're hoping to launch this fall, or at least to figure out how to launch it remotely. The other thing that's happened since I arrived is I started meeting informally with people in environmental engineering and other folks on campus, and there's really an appetite to kind of establish an infrastructure for people interested in environmental health. So we established the center within the medical school. Rima came and spoke kind of right before the pandemic hit. It was lovely to have her. So we are kind of revisiting actually on Monday how to proceed in the era of the pandemic going forward. So the last thing I wanted to cover in the last 5 minutes relates to asthma disparities, and in particular how the biomedical research enterprise, I think, has been misguided in how they have approached asthma disparities. And I don't need to go over this slide with this audience, but I want to give some examples of how the biomedical literature assumes that characteristics associated with minority race are inherent, and how problematic this is. So this was a study that was published, and the title was "Race and Ethnicity Have a Significant Influence on Fractional Exhaled Nitric Oxide." And I would first point out, for those of us who like to think about causal language, is that this wording, it really implies that race causes pulmonary eosinophilic inflammation, which is problematic in and of itself. But more problematic is this statement. So this was their conclusion. Although there are significant differences in FeNO values among races and ethnicities, the current cutoff point at 50 parts per billion is sufficient to separate healthy from asthmatic populations in adults. However, for Black children, we suggest increasing the cutoff point from 35 to 40 to avoid unnecessary diagnosis and treatment. And never once did this team consider that there was underlying pathology related to environmental exposures or allergies. And instead, there's a major risk here of normalizing something that is potentially, an unhealthy state in the population of Black kids. And so when you start to see this. You see it everywhere. Here's another example. So this was from a multi-center asthma, NIH funded study group. And so this study, they happened to have a population of kids, some of whom were Black, some of whom were white, who had asthma, and they created an exacerbation outcome, which was a score. Here is the unadjusted estimate of the difference between Black and whites in terms of their exacerbation score. So the average score for Blacks for exacerbations was 1.23, and for whites, 0.56. So this was a difference of about 0.7. They adjusted for age and sex. It didn't change much. They adjusted for socioeconomic status in a pretty crude way, and I'll explain that in the next slide. And they reduced the Black-white difference to 0.42. So this is a 40% reduction in the Black-white difference simply by adjusting for SES. But because Black race was still associated with ED visit risk, this is what the authors concluded down here. The present study extends the finding of an increase in asthma burden in Black compared with white children to a phenotype with severe or difficult to treat asthma. And so they're conflating race with an asthma phenotype rather than context and what race means. And so specifically, they adjusted for residents in an urban area, health insurance type, and median income in the zip code of residence. And that very crude adjustment reduced the differences in the exacerbation score by 40%. And I'd like to point out that this degree of reduction would dwarf the advances in reducing disparities that have been made over more than 3 decades. And so we're missing the big picture here by not understanding the magnitude of a 40% reduction, but we're not also, there's a statistical methods issue and conceptualization here, which is that just because race continues to be significantly associated with an outcome doesn't mean that it is independently so, because there are many confounders that can't be accounted for. So I would say that, this self-reported race as a cause of worse asthma is implicit in much of the biomedical research enterprise. There are papers that talk about Black phenotypes. This has implications for funding. If grants for health disparities have been disproportionately awarded to the study of individual biologic factors or genetics rather than community and societal factors, maybe that explains why we really haven't made any headway. And I would really love to see the NIH and other funders do away with the term inner city and also not use the term urban, because that is shorthand for racial and ethnic membership, and it reduces the problem to one that is not only overly simplified, but it reduces it to a problem of race. And then the leap is made that there's some sort of innate biologic cause. And so terminology change would be helpful here. I'm going to skip this. This was a paper that I wrote with a couple of colleagues about how to reframe this sort of research and to really think about a biopsychosocial model rather than one that's so biologically focused. And we made some recommendations about asthma disparities research. None of these will surprise you. And with that, I will say thank you. And I'm happy to take questions with whatever remaining time we have.
So thank you, Elizabeth. Excuse me. We have some time. Welcome all questions. You've raised several provocative issues across a range of interesting research. And so I'll invite anybody from the 30 participants online to ask away. And I'll let Elizabeth sort of address them. Don't see any coming up yet. Don't be bashful.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think because of, well, I guess my question is, oftentimes touching on the stuff you were mentioning, oftentimes race is, and especially in epi research, is like, oh, well, race is a risk factor for these diseases. And I find that terminology very problematic. So do you think, especially with the climate that's going on around Black Lives Matter, those ways of thinking will be changed in the framework of epidemiological research?
I think there's a growing appreciation of the pitfall, the wrong-headedness of thinking about race as a biologic construct. I can speak more about it from kind of the medical framework. There was a great piece that someone wrote, and of course it escapes me who it was that wrote it and where it was, but they talked about the role of medical training and thinking about race. And you know, one example is that we are taught to see patterns, and so you'll be given, as a part of your training, here's a patient vignette, and the race of the patient is included, and maybe you're meant to pick sickle cell disease as what you think the likely diagnosis is, or maybe you're meant to pick cystic fibrosis because the description is a white child. And the argument that was made, that I think is a valid one, is while it is true that, you know, there's an association between certain ancestry and having sickle cell polymorphism, that there are actually swaths of populations in the Mediterranean and other parts of the world that also have a high risk of sickle cell disease. And by conflating sort of this pattern making of race with certain diseases and using race sort of as shorthand for potentially, you know, at greater risk of having this genetic background, that it's actually harmed the practice of medicine. And I can tell you an anecdote from my own clinical experience, is that I had a patient who was African American and had pretty significant asthma. And I saw him a couple of times, and he was spotty in his follow-up, and eventually he landed with pulmonary, and they did a sweat test on him, and he had cystic fibrosis. And so I fell into that pitfall too, where I didn't consider a diagnosis because he was Black. And the whole point of this piece was that it actually leads to worse medical care, because you don't start to, we've been taught to conflate race with a particular disease. I think the world of epidemiology is far more sophisticated in that regard than the world of medicine is. And I think that that is going to, you know, epidemiology is already light years ahead of medicine, and I think they'll continue to have progress in that regard. If you are someone who likes social media, there have been some great discussions about this topic on Twitter, and particularly by, I'm blanking on her last name because I only know her Twitter handle, @EpiEllie. So she's an epidemiologist at Boston University, and she's tackled this quite a bit.
Other questions? Rob, I see you're, and Rima as well, have our open mic. Do you have a question or just?
Why don't Rob go ahead first?
So I like that discussion that you just had, Elizabeth. You know, I mean, I think there are a number of issues. One is how you make a diagnosis. You know, and I think that's a little different. You know, the sort of missing cystic fibrosis in a Black man with asthma, or missing sickle cell disease in somebody who's Mediterranean. Yeah, I mean, some of misdiagnosis may be because people just don't know, you know, something may be prevalent and they don't know about it. But some of it is that it's unlikely, you know, and you know, the silly thing about what you think of when you hear hoofbeats. You know, I mean, I think it's easy to fall into it. It's easy to go looking for diagnoses that are not common, and or to chastise people for doing that. So, yeah, I don't know how frequent cystic fibrosis is in African American men, but I wouldn't chastise yourself too much over missing that, you know. But
yeah,
I think the issue is more, to me, the issue is more, what do you do about it? And that's an even more challenging problem, because, you know, clinicians never think about environmental interventions, or, you know, maybe beyond allergen control, which has sort of become, you know, it's come into its own in the last 20 years. You know, the medical model makes money for pharma, you know, and so to me, that's maybe a more, it's both a big part of the problem, and it's more challenging what you do about that. You know, I mean,
right. And
that's what clinicians are taught to do, give drugs, you know.
Right. And I think there's no question about that. I have stand up and give talks at the Quad AI meeting, which is mainly clinicians, and, you know, I've had people stand up and say, I think this is all BS, you know, the environment doesn't matter. And so I think I gave a plenary session where I showed that slide of, you know, structural racism and housing, and it doesn't fit into the medical model, which is largely informed, and I think you talked about this, by payment structure, right? Oftentimes at the bottom of any structures, it's about sort of money and power, and there's no way for us to pay for that. There are lots of people who think about, you know, with value-based care coming along, whether that can be leveraged to try to use healthcare dollars, which would also then have clinicians think about using healthcare dollars for addressing, and not just allergen, but other, you know, social needs that a patient may have that has a huge impact on their health outcomes. The other thing that I think that is really important to say is that, like, this topic is very uncomfortable for, I think, everybody, but in the medical community, to talk about. And I think that adds a layer of discomfort that makes it challenging too. So I think there's a cultural shift that's needed, as well as you really kind of have to overhaul the healthcare payment system. And maybe, you know, I'm a bit cynical about it, but I think COVID has, you know, everyone knew the healthcare system was broken before. If there's any chance of it being fixed and being, you know, money being directed to ways that have the greatest impact, maybe it's the straits that it's in that has been revealed by the COVID pandemic, but I don't know.
Rima, did you have a question?
Yes, I had a comment. Thank you, Ed. Well, thanks, Elizabeth. This is really fascinating and a little infuriating, I guess, just realizing how, you know, the odds are stacked against certain groups like ages and decades ago, and it's so hard to change these things. I guess, so your talk is making me think, you know, in LA, we see a lot of, I guess we can call it racial segregation, right? Like, we look at our maps and you see these small little areas are very highly Hispanic or very highly African American or Asian, etc. And you kind of just assume, you know, that's how it was laid out. And you're making me think that, no, maybe we have to go back way, way, way in time and understand how come. Yeah.
Right. And I think what I haven't quite totally grasped yet, and I need to learn more about here in Austin, is the relationship between the segregation that occurred that was focused on the Black population and how that affected the Latinx population, because that population also lives on the East Side. And I think the people that I've learned the most from about this sort of, you know, the history behind all of this are people in the sociology field. And there's a early career faculty member, Ade Adamson, who's a dermatologist here. And he likes to talk about how he was a spousal recruit because his wife is a faculty member in the African American Studies department. And they together teach a course on, you know, racialization he doesn't talk so much about research, but the research informs, you know, how the medical system proceeds. And so he teaches that course. And I've learned a lot from him. And there are also some great books to read as well. But yes, there's typically a story that you find underneath it all. It's not, certainly, you know, people like to be near people who are culturally similar to them. But that's hardly the story for African Americans, and likely not the story for other populations either.
And it's what's fascinating to me is even if you take a purely data-driven approach, like we did this analysis in Madres where we would generally assume, oh, our entire population is maybe low income and predominantly Hispanic. If you just look at their built environment, neighborhood, chemical exposures, and you kind of do this multivariate separation of how that segregates, you see like clearly drawn lines that are, you know, street blocks away. It's, you know, so it's hard to convince yourself that there's no bigger administrative, political, policy related reason why those lines were drawn the way they were.
Right. So you're saying that when you go and sort of just look at the profile of environmental exposures, that like you do principal components analysis or something, that you can see a clear spatial distribution of certain
exactly, and
patterns.
Like from one side of the street to the next, you know, like
wow,
such clearly drawn lines that it wouldn't make sense if this was purely random distribution of, you know, data. So
right. Wow.
So Frank Gilliland has a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was, you know, I liked your talk a lot. And, you know, I totally, you know, get the idea of structural racism and how it has all the correlates with it that you described. But thinking more deeply about it, I go back to my time when I worked with American Indians. And I think there are biologic constructs that we don't want to forget in this time that are important. And one is like, you know, H-flu, influenza vaccines, right? And during that time we were rolling out H-flu vaccines, and they didn't appear to actually work very well in American Indians and Alaska Natives. And in fact, there's now pretty well recognized that that the responses to the vaccines are different in different populations, especially American Indians in Alaska, and they weren't getting protected from those vaccines as well as other populations. And it's probably a biologic difference, best we could tell. So there are some things that are biological, and we don't want to forget, you know, that you probably need, you know, a different sort of vaccine development strategy for that population because of how they respond. They're very poor and they have different lifestyles, but it's more than that, I think, from my understanding. So it's not that I'm trying to diminish the importance of structural racism and the history that leads to you know, differences in asthma risk by where people live, but it's, you know, something that we don't want to necessarily just lose track of certain things that might be important. I don't know what the balance is, but you know, I think it's important to retain some idea that there's differences by people's ancestry that could affect their you know, their response to treatment or their health outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's important to hold on to, and I think it's the way that it's framed. And I think ancestry is a much more helpful framing, you know, because you can take a look at people, pull them off the street and look at ancestry and get very different, you know, ancestry distribution than you might expect. So I think that's sort of a framing is helpful. But I think the other point is that obviously it's not that innate biology doesn't exist among people with different ancestries, and because of pressure from malaria, for example, that's endemic, there are going to be certain populations with certain ancestries that are going to be more likely to have sickle cell trait and then sickle cell disease. But I think what's happened is that our default is to think about the biology. And so when you talk about the vaccine responses, 5 years ago, I would have said, of course, that's biologic. But now part of me is saying, well, it could be biologic, but we should not rule out the fact that it could be environmental or contextual. And so that's what I worry about, is that at least for someone who's gone through medical training is, and you can see it throughout the examples of the literature, you know, those 2 papers, there are many more. This is not because, you know, some individual author sort of thought about it and said it has to be biologic. It's because that's the default position that we have. And you're right, we don't need to ignore it, because there may be some sort of ancestry, genetic ancestry that's linked to some sort of polymorphism. But I would also want to point out that when you do population genetic research, you know, over and over again, we've now learned and been burned by the fact that that genetics cannot really, it's hopelessly confounded for explaining differences between populations, but that doesn't mean that it may not be important for differences within populations. And there's some great sort of classic papers from population geneticists that have illustrated this. One of them is, I think, was in Science and was called the chopsticks gene. So there's that other layer of complexity to the genetic piece, which is that we want that to explain differences between populations. And sometimes we don't appreciate the fact that those findings are really confounded to the point where, you know, I think the consensus among that group of researchers that do population genetics is that it's really no longer acceptable or considered valid scientific approach to use, you know, to attribute differences between populations to genetics without discussing the fact that this is a marker and is hopelessly confounded by all these other factors that are not measured. I don't know if that helped answer your question or respond to your comment.
No, I just think it's just a balance, I think, appropriate balance. And right now, I think the balance is too far to one side, but too far to the other side probably isn't the right answer either. And to your point about environmental factors, we know that in like the Faroe Islands, you know, the perfluorinated compounds affect responses to vaccinations in kids pretty directly. So we know that there's environmental factors that could have that effect. So it's not, you know, something that's, you know, doesn't have any support for it. So
Right.
So I appreciated your talk. It was certainly thought-provoking. I have a question, or comment and a question, I guess, which maybe gets more at the sociological aspect of this. It's a little discouraging to think about, you know, the implications that, in fact, in the Roadhouse sort of Baltimore setting of, you know, that in a way the mouse infestation exposure, this notion of cleaning up a home or cleaning up a block of homes really is going to be ineffective, because it's a much, you know, wider dimension. And thinking about how we do this, what the cost implications are of trying to make a change, it doesn't seem like it's particularly feasible to take everybody and move them to a lower pollution place. It seems like we have to sort of figure out how to clean up places where they are, or, you know, I don't see how we actually just wholesale move whole neighborhoods. But the other aspect of this, which gets into the current sort of COVID pandemic, is this thought about, you know, the relative sort of spreader, super spreader events of living in, you know, dense housing versus living in a more spread out way. It certainly is the case here, although we don't have the row house type layout in Southern California, particularly. We do have redlining that has been, you know, institutionalized here across Los Angeles, as Rima suggested, you know, for many decades, and has been a problem. And I think that's probably true in many places around the country. And so how we think about trying to break that and decouple that and use that, you know, think about how do we sort of keep people apart, minimize these environmental impacts, improve public health. How we balance all that, I think, is a real question.
Yes. Yes, it's a huge problem. And I think you're exactly right. The housing mobility study, you know, I don't think that that's a wholesale solution across the United States. I think that it would have potentially two implications. One would be that, you know, if there was a particular set of children that were really struggling with their asthma and really, you know, they were open and interested in moving, and attempts at addressing their home really were not effective, then having this as an option for those cases, I think, would be good, depending on what our study finds. And then I think the second point that it would raise is the broader point of you know, how much does neighborhood matter? And if it matters, because it's not practical to sort of say, okay, everybody's moving and not everybody wants to move. What I didn't address is that obviously it's a very sensitive issue to talk about people who are from a minority group moving, right? That has to be something that they desire to do. But on top of that, even if everyone who lived in highly segregated, high poverty neighborhoods wanted to move, it's not feasible. But it would speak to the fact that there's a systematic neighborhood issue, and people who are health policy and urban policy experts and have the experience and expertise that I don't, I think could start to think about how do you reinvest in those neighborhoods? How do you address the built environment? How do you think about mitigating any excess outdoor air pollution that they're exposed to, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not going to be solved in any sort of short-term way. And, you know, like I said, the goal of the study isn't necessarily to suggest that everyone should move, but it's more to try to answer the question about neighborhood.
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, we've come to the end of our seminar portion. We actually are going to sort of switch to yet another Zoom meeting.
Okay.
We would invite everybody that's interested to continue this discussion and talk about potential collaborations with Dr. Matsui. And so we posted in the chat line the link, the Zoom link to the meeting room for the next meeting that will take place sort of in the broader scale. So thank you all for participating. Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing these provocative, interesting, and I think important insights and understanding as we try to deal with the environmental, as you know, as pointed out, the balance between the environmental and the medical considerations in improving public health. And we'll encourage everybody to consider thinking about moving to the other Zoom meeting to continue the discussion. So thank you.
All right.